Section 30 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Charles Dickens, 1812 to 1870. From Forster's Life of Dickens. Very different was his face in those days from that which photography has made familiar to the present generation. A look of youthfulness first attracted you, then a candor and openness of expression which made you sure of the qualities within. The features were very good. He had a capital forehead, a firm nose, with full wide nostrils, eyes wonderfully beaming with intellect and running over with humor and cheerfulness, and a rather prominent mouth, strongly marked with sensibility. The head was altogether well formed and symmetrical, and the air and carriage of it was extremely spirited. The hair, so scant and grizzled in later days, was then of a rich brown and most luxuriant abundance, and the bearded face of his last 2 decades had hardly a vestige of hair or whisker. But there was that in the face, as I first recollect it, which no time could change, and which remained implanted on it unalterably to the last. This was the quickness, keenness, and practical power, the eager, restless, energetic outlook on each several feature, that seemed to tell so little of a student or writer of books, and so much of a man of action and business in the world. Light and motion flashed from every part of it. It was as if made of steel, was said of it, 4 or 5 years after the time to which I am referring, by a most original and delicate observer, the late Mrs. Carlyle. What a face is his to meet in a drawing-room, wrote Leigh Hunt to me the morning after I had made them known to each other. It has the life and soul in it of 50 human beings. In such sayings are expressed not alone the restless and resistless vivacity and force of which I have spoken, but that also which lay beneath them, of steadiness and hard endurance. 1838. From J.T. Field's Yesterdays with Authors. How well I recall the bleak winter evening in 1842, when I first saw the handsome, glowing face of the young man who was even then famous over half the globe. He came bounding into the Tremont House, fresh from the steamer that had brought him to our shores, and his cheery voice rang through the hall as he gave a quick glance at the new scenes opening upon him in a strange land on first arriving at a transatlantic hotel. "Here we are," he shouted, as the lights burst upon the merry party just entering the house, and several gentlemen came forward to meet him. Ah, how happy and buoyant he was then, young, handsome, almost worshipped for his genius, belted round by such troops of friends as rarely ever man had, coming to a new country to make new conquests of fame and honor. Surely it was a sight long to be remembered and never wholly to be forgotten. The splendor of his endowments and the personal interest he had won to himself called forth all the enthusiasm of old and young America, and I am glad to have been among the first to welcome his arrival. You ask me what was his appearance as he ran, or rather flew, up the steps of the hotel and sprang into the hall. He seemed all on fire with curiosity, and alive as I never saw mortal before. From top to toe, every fibre of his body was unrestrained and alert. What vigor, what keenness, what freshness of spirit possessed him! He laughed all over, and did not care who heard him. He seemed like the emperor of cheerfulness on a cruise of pleasure, determined to conquer a realm or 2 of fun every hour of his overflowing existence. That night impressed itself on my memory for all time, so far as I am concerned with things sublunary. It was Dickens, the true Boz, in flesh and blood, who stood before us at last, and with my companions, 3 or 4 lads of my own age, I determined to sit up late that night. 1842. From the Cowden Clarke's Recollections of Writers. Charles Dickens had that acute perception of the comic side of things, which causes irrepressible brimming of the eyes, and what eyes his were! Large, dark blue, exquisitely shaped, fringed with magnificently long and thick lashes, they now swam in liquid, limpid suffusion. When tears started into them from a sense of humor or a sense of pathos, and now darted quick flashes of fire, when some generous indignation at injustice, or some high-wrought feeling of admiration at magnanimity, or some sudden emotion of interest and excitement touched him. Swift-glancing, appreciative, rapidly observant, truly superb orbits they were, worthy of the other features in his manly, handsome face. The mouth was singularly mobile, full-lipped, well-shaped, and expressive, sensitive, nay, restless, in its susceptibility to impression that swayed him or sentiment that moved him. He, who saw into apparently slightest trifles that were fraught to his perception of deeper significance, he, who beheld human nature with insight almost superhuman, and who revered good and abhorred evil with intensity, showed instantaneously by his expressive countenance the kind of idea that possessed him. This made his conversation enthralling, his acting first-rate, and his reading superlative. End of section 30.
Section 31 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adele Pooley. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Isaac Disraeli, 1766 to 1848. From S.C. Hall's Retrospect of a Long Life. I found him a most kindly and courteous gentleman, obviously of a tender, loving nature, and certainly more than willing to give me what I asked for. I do not recall him as like his illustrious son. If my memory serves me rightly, he was rather fair than dark, not above the middle height, with features calm in expression. His eyes, which, however, were always covered with spectacles, sparkling and searching, but indicating less the fire of genius than the patient inquiry that formed the staple of his books. 1823. From Beaconsfield's Memoirs of Isaac Disraeli. As the world has been fond of personal details respecting men who have been celebrated, I will mention that he was fair, with a Bourbon nose, and brown eyes of extraordinary beauty and lustre. He wore a small black velvet cap, but his white hair latterly touched his shoulders in curls, almost as flowing as in his boyhood. His extremities were delicate and well formed, and his leg, at his last hour, as shapely as in his youth, which showed the vigour of his frame. Latterly he had become corpulent. He did not excel in conversation, though in his domestic circle he was garrulous. Everything interested him, and blind and 82, he was still as susceptible as a child. He more resembled Goldsmith than any man that I can compare him to. In his conversation, his apparent confusion of ideas ending with some felicitous phrase of genius, his naivete, his simplicity not untouched with a dash of sarcasm affecting innocence. One was often reminded of the gifted and interesting friend of Burke and Johnson. There was, however, one trait in which my father did not resemble Goldsmith. He had no vanity. Indeed, one of his few infirmities was rather a deficiency of self-esteem. From Chorley's Personal Reminiscences. Mr. Disraeli was announced. An old gentleman, strictly in his appearance, a countenance which at first glance, owing perhaps to the mouth which hangs, I fancied slightly chargeable with solidity of expression, but which developed strong sense as it talked, a rather soigné style of dress for so old a man, and a manner good-humoured, complimentary to Gebir, discursive and prosy, bespeaking that engrossment and interest in his own pursuits which might be expected to be found in a person so patient in research and collection. But there is a tone of philosophe, or I fancied it, which I did not quite like. 1838. End of section 31.
Section 32 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. John Dryden, 1631 to 1700. From Anderson's Poets of Great Britain. Of the person, private life and domestic manners of Dryden, very few particulars are known. His picture by Kneller would lead us to suppose that he was graceful in his person, but Kneller was a great mender of nature. From the State Poems we learn that he was a short, thick man. The nickname given him by his enemies was Poet Squab. I remember plain John Dryden, says a writer in the Gentleman's Magazine for February 1745, who was then 87 years of age, before he paid his court to the great in one uniform clothing of Norwich drugget. I have eat tarts with him and Madame Reeve, the actress, at the Mulberry Garden, when our author advanced to a sword and Chedreux wig, probably the wig that Swift has ridiculed in The Battle of the Books. Posterity is absolutely mistaken as to that great man. Though forced to be a satirist, he was the mildest creature breathing, and the readiest to help the young and deserving. Though his comedies are horribly full of double entendre, yet 'twas owing to a false compliance for a dissolute age. He was in company the modestest man that ever conversed. From those notices which he has very liberally given us of himself, it appears that his conversation was slow and dull, his humour saturnine and reserved, and that he was none of those who endeavour to break jests in company and make repartees. From Gilfillan's Life of Dryden, ****. As to his habits and manners, little is known, and that little is worn threadbare by his many biographers. In appearance he became in his maturer years fat and florid, and obtained the name of Poet Squab. His portraits show a shrewd but rather sluggish face, with long grey hair floating down his cheeks, not unlike Coleridge, but without his dreamy eye like a nebulous star. His conversation was less sprightly than solid. Sometimes men suspected that he had sold all his thoughts to his booksellers. His manners are by his friends pronounced modest, and the word modest has since been amiably confounded by his biographers with pure. Bashful he seems to have been to awkwardness, but he was by no means a model of the virtues. He loved to sit at Will's coffee house and be the arbiter of criticism. His favourite stimulus was snuff, and his favourite amusement angling. He had a bad address, a down look, and little of the air of a gentleman. From Christie's Memoir of Dryden, ****. Some notion of Dryden's personal appearance may be gathered from contemporary notices. He was of short stature, stout, and ruddy in the face. Rochester christened him Poet Squab, and Tom Brown always calls him Little Bayes. Shadwell, in his Medal of John Bayes, sneers at him as a cherry-cheeked dunce. Another lampooner calls him learned and florid. Pope remembered him as plump and of fresh colour, with a down look. Lady de Longueville, who died in 1763 at the age of 100, told oldies that she remembered Dryden dining with her husband, and that the most remarkable part of his appearance was an uncommon distance between his eyes. He had a large mole on his right cheek. The friendlier writer of some lines on his portrait by Closterman says, "A sleepy eye he shows, and no sweet feature." He appears to have become grey comparatively early, and he let his grey hair grow long. We see him with his long grey locks in the portrait by which, through engravings, his face is best known to us, painted by Kneller in 1698. The face, as we know it by that picture and the engravings, is handsome. It indicates intellect, and sensual characteristics are not wanting. End of section 32.
Section 33 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. George Eliot, 1819 to 1880. Marianne Evans. George Eliot, 1819 to 1880. In more than one striking passage in his novels, Mr. Hardy has recognized the fact that the beauty of the future, as the race is more developed in intellect, cannot be the mere physical beauty of the past, and in one of the most remarkable he says that ideal physical beauty is incompatible with mental development and a full recognition of the evil things. Mental luminousness must be fed with the oil of life, even though there is already a physical need for it. And this was the case with George Eliot. The face was one of a group of four, not all equally like each other, but all of the same spiritual family, and with a curious interdependence of likeness. These four are Dante, Savonarola, Cardinal Newman, and herself. In the group of which George Eliot was one there is the same straight wall of brow, the droop of the powerful nose, mobile lips, touched with strong passion, kept resolutely under control, a square jaw, which would make the face stern, were it not counteracted by the sweet smile of lip and eye. The 2 or 3 portraits that exist, though valuable, give but a very imperfect presentiment. The mere shape of the head would be the despair of any painter. It was so grand and massive that it would scarcely be possible to represent it without giving the idea of disproportion to the frame, of which no one ever thought for a moment when they saw her, although it was a surprise, when she stood up, to see that after all she was but a little fragile woman, who bore this weight of brow and brain. Everything in her aspect and presence was in keeping with the bent of her soul. The deeply lined face, the 2 marked and massive features, were united with an air of delicate refinement, which in one way was the more impressive because it seemed to proceed so entirely from within. Nay, the inward beauty would sometimes quite transform the external harshness. There would be moments when the thin hands that entwined themselves in their eagerness, the earnest figure that bowed forward to speak and hear, the deep gaze moving from one face to another with a grave appeal, all these seemed the transparent symbols that showed the presence of a wise, benignant soul. But it was the voice which best revealed her, a voice whose subdued, intense, and tremulous richness seemed to environ her uttered words with the mystery of a work of feeling and must remain untold. And then again, when in moments of more intimate converse some current of emotion would set strongly through her soul, when she would raise her head in unconscious absorption and look out into the unseen, her expression was not one to be soon forgotten. They had not, indeed, the serene felicity of souls to whose childlike confidence all heaven and earth are fair. Rather it was the look, if I may use a Platonic phrase, of a strenuous demiurge, of a soul on which high tasks are laid, and which finds in their accomplishment its only imagination of joy. I was disappointed when I found the illustrated papers gave no portraits of George Eliot, and I afterwards learned that, celebrated as she was in other ways, she enjoys the rare and perhaps unique distinction that she was never photographed. Two portraits of her are, however, in existence. One by Mr. Lawrence hangs in Mr. Blackwood's drawing-room in Edinburgh. The other, by Mr. Buxton, was in her own house at Chelsea. She is described as a woman of large, massive, and homely features, which were softened and irradiated by a gracious and winning smile. The size, shape, and poise of her head were very noticeable, and some of her friends have been struck by her resemblance to the portrait of Savonarola by Fra Bartolomeo. Her voice was rich and melodious, and those who best knew her speak of her as a strangely fascinating and sympathetic woman, who left on every one who approached her an impression of goodness and greatness. Her conversation had no traces of the rich humour which runs through some of her writings, but she joined very heartily in the jocularity of others. End of section 33.
Section 34 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Peter. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Henry Fielding, 1707 to 1754. From Roscoe's Life of Fielding, ****. With regard to his personal appearance, Fielding was strongly built, robust, and in height rather exceeding 6 feet. He was also remarkably active, till repeated attacks of gout had broken down the vigour of a fine constitution. Naturally of a dignified presence, he was equally impressive in his tone and manner, which added to his peculiarly marked features. His conversational powers and rare wit must have given him a decided influence in general society, and not a little ascendancy over the minds of common men. From Jefferson's Novels and Novelists, ****. That our nation was well and favourably represented by him, amongst the lads at the university, there can be no doubt, for he was a magnificent fellow, frank in bearing, agile as a trained wrestler, rather exceeding 6 feet in height, with a face, both by aristocratic features and gallant expression, remarkably engaging, with a fresh, slightly ruddy complexion, and a winning smile of the most mirthful intelligence, with an air commanding, but free from the slightest taint of haughtiness, and lastly, with a disposition as well endowed as his mind, generous and truly noble as became one sprung from the seed of kings. 1725. From Lawrence's Life of Fielding, ****. The personal appearance of the great novelist has been thus described by his friend, Mr. Arthur Murphy. Henry Fielding was in stature rather rising above 6 feet, his frame of body large and remarkably robust, till the gout had broken the vigour of his constitution. His features were marked and striking, so much so, that a portrait of him was painted by his friend Hogarth from memory, with the assistance of a profile which had been cut in paper with a pair of scissors by a lady. Though he was singularly handsome in his youth, in his later years it appears, from his own account, that his gouty and dropsical figure was anything but agreeable to behold. But his cheerfulness and good temper rendered him to the last a delightful companion, and endeared him to his family and friends. End of section 34. Section 35 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Peter. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. John Gay, 1688 to 1732. From Cox's Life of John Gay. His physiognomy does not appear to have been remarkable for strong lines or expressive features. It rather denoted benignity and meekness. In his person Gay was inclined to corpulency, a circumstance which he humorously alludes to in his epistle to Lord Burlington. "You knew fat bars might tire, and mounted sent me forth your trusty squire." His natural corpulency was increased by extreme indolence, for which his friends often rallied him. Swift, in a letter to the Duchess of Queensberry, thus expresses himself on this subject. "You need not be in pain about Mr. Gay's stock of health. I promise you he will spend it all upon laziness, and run deep in debt by a winter's repose in town. Therefore I entreat your grace will order him to move his chaps less, and his legs more, the 6 cold months, else he will spend all his money in physic and coach hire." The 8th of October, 1731. In the early part of his life, Gay was extremely fond of dress. Pope also touches upon this weakness in a letter to Swift, on the 18th of December, 1713. "One Mr. Gay, an unhappy youth, who writes pastorals during the time of divine service, whose case is the more deplorable, as he hath miserably lavished away all that silver he should have reserved for his soul's health in buttons and loops for his coat." From Thackeray's English Humorists, ****. In the portraits of the literary worthies of the early part of the last century, Gay's face is the pleasantest perhaps of all. It appears adorned with neither periwig nor nightcap, the full dress and negligee of learning, without which the painters of those days scarcely ever portrayed wits, and he laughs at you over his shoulder with an honest boyish glee, an artless sweet humour. He was so kind, so gentle, so jocular, so delightfully brisk at times, so dismally woebegone at others, such a natural good creature, that the giants loved him. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Adele Pooley. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Edward Gibbon, 1737 to 1794. From Coleman's Random Recollections. The learned Gibbon was a curious counterbalance to the learned, may I not say the less learned, Johnson. Their manners and tastes, both in writing and conversation, were as different as their habiliments. On the day I first sat down with Johnson in his rusty brown suit and his black worsted stockings, Gibbon was placed opposite to me in a suit of flowered velvet, with a bag and sword. Each had his measured phraseology, and Johnson's famous parallel between Dryden and Pope might be loosely parodied in reference to himself and Gibbon. Johnson's style was grand, and Gibbon's elegant. The stateliness of the former was sometimes pedantic, and the latter was occasionally finical. Johnson marched to kettledrums and trumpets. Gibbon moved to flutes and hautbois. Johnson hewed passages through the Alps, while Gibbon levelled walks through parks and gardens. Mauled as I had been by Johnson, Gibbon poured balm upon my bruises by condescending once or twice in the course of the evening to talk with me. The great historian was light and playful, suiting his matter to the capacity of a boy. But it was done more suo. Still his mannerisms prevailed. Still he tapped his snuff-box. Still he smirked and smiled, and rounded his periods with the same air of good breeding, as if he were conversing with men. His mouth, mellifluous as Plato's, was a round hole nearly in the centre of his visage. From Lord Sheffield's Gibbon. Mr. Pavillard has described to me the astonishment with which he gazed on Mr. Gibbon standing before him, a thin little figure with a large head, disputing and urging with the greatest ability all the best arguments that had ever been used in favour of popery. Mr. Gibbon many years ago became very fat and corpulent, but he had uncommonly small bones, and was very slightly made. From Quarterly Review, 1809 *. As to his manners in society, without doubt the agreeableness of Gibbon was neither that yielding and retiring complaisance, nor that modesty which is forgettable of self. But his vanity never showed itself in an offensive manner. Anxious to succeed and to please, he wished to command attention, and obtained it without difficulty by a conversation animated, sprightly, and full of matter. All that was dictatorial in his tone betrayed not so much that desire of domineering over others, which is always offensive, as confidence in himself. Notwithstanding this, his conversation never carried one away. Its fault was a kind of arrangement which never permitted him to say anything unless well. End of section 36.
Section 37 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. William Godwin, 1756 to 1836. From S. C. Hall's Memories of Great Men. In person he was remarkably sedate and solemn, resembling in dress and manner a dissenting minister, rather than the advocate of free thought in all things, religious, moral, social, and intellectual. He was short and stout, his clothes loosely and carelessly put on, and usually old and worn. His hands were generally in his pockets. He had a remarkably large bald head and a weak voice, seeming generally half asleep when he walked and even when he talked. Few who saw this man of calm exterior, quiet manners, and inexpressive features, could have believed him to have originated 3 romances, Falkland, Caleb Williams, and St. Leon, not yet forgotten because of their terrible excitements, and the work Political Justice, which for a time created a sensation that was a fear in every state of Europe. Lamb called him a good-natured heathen. Southey said of him in 1797, "He has large noble eyes, and a nose, oh, most abominable nose." From George Ticknor's Life. Godwin is as far removed from everything feverish and exciting as if his head had never been filled with anything but geometry. He is now about 65, stout, well built, and unbroken by age, with a cool, dogged manner, exactly opposite to everything I had imagined of the author of St. Leon and Caleb Williams. 1819. From H. Martineau's Autobiography. The mention of Coleridge reminds me, I hardly know why, of Godwin, who was an occasional morning visitor of mine. I looked upon him as a curious monument of a bygone state of society, and there was still a good deal that was interesting in him. His fine head was striking, and his countenance remarkable. It must not be judged of by the pretended likeness put forth in Fraser's Magazine about that time, and attributed, with the whole set, to Maclise. The high Tory favourites of the magazine were exhibited to the best advantage, while Liberals were represented as Godwin was. Because the finest thing about him was his noble head, they put on a hat, and they represented him in profile because he had lost his teeth and his lips fell in. No notion of Godwin's face could have been formed from that caricature. 1833. End of section 37.
Section 38 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Facio. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Oliver Goldsmith, 1728 to 1774. From Forster's Life and Times of Oliver Goldsmith. You scarcely can conceive how much 8 years of disappointment, anguish, and study have worn me down. Imagine to yourself a pale, melancholy visage, with 2 great wrinkles between the eyebrows, with an eye disgustingly severe, and a big wig, and you may have a perfect picture of my present appearance. I can neither laugh nor drink, have contracted a hesitating, disagreeable manner of speaking, and a visage that looks ill nature itself. In short, I have thought myself into a settled melancholy, and an utter disgust of all that life brings with it. 1759. From Boswell's Life of Dr. Johnson. He was very much what the French call un étourdi, and from vanity and an eager desire of being conspicuous wherever he was, he frequently talked carelessly without knowledge of the subject, or even without thought. His person was short, his countenance coarse and vulgar, his deportment that of a scholar awkwardly affecting the easy gentleman. 1763. From R. Walsh's British Poets, ****. Nothing could be more amiable than the general features of his mind. Those of his person were not perhaps so engaging. His stature was under the middle size, his body strongly built, his limbs more sturdy than elegant. His complexion was pale, his forehead low, his face almost round and pitted with the smallpox, but marked with strong lines of thinking. His first appearance was not captivating, but when he grew easy and cheerful in company, he relaxed into such a display of good humor as soon removed every unfavorable impression. End of section 38.
Section 39 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. David Gray, 1838 to 1861. From Buchanan's Life of David Gray. At 21 years of age, David was a tall young man, slightly but firmly built, and with a stoop at the shoulders. His head was small, fringed with black curly hair. Want of candor was not his fault, though he seldom looked one in the face. His eyes, however, were large and dark, full of intelligence and humor, harmonizing well with the long, thin nose and nervous lips. The great black eyes and woman's mouth betrayed the creature of impulse, one whose reasoning faculties were small, but whose temperament was like red-hot coal. He sympathized with much that was lofty, noble, and true in poetry, and with much that was absurd and suicidal in the poet. He carried sympathy to the highest pitch of enthusiasm. He shed tears over the memories of Keats and Burns, and he was corybantic in his execution of a Scotch reel. 1859. From R. M. Milne's Notice on David Gray. I was told the young man wished to see me, and when he came into the room I at once saw it was no other than the young Scotch poet. It was a light, well-built, but somewhat stooping figure, with a countenance that at once brought strongly to my recollection a cast of a face of Shelley in his youth, which I had seen at Mr. Leigh Hunt's. There was the same full brow, outlooking eyes, and sensitive, melancholy mouth. From Hedderwick's Memoir of David Gray. In person, the deceased poet was tall, with a slight stoop. His head was not large, but his temperament was of the keenest and brightest edge. With black curling hair, eyes dark, large, and lustrous, and a complexion of almost feminine delicacy, his appearance never failed to make a favorable impression on strangers. End of section 39. Recording by Laura Langston. Section 40 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Thomas Gray, 1716 to 1771. From Gosse's Gray. In one of Philip Gray's fits of extravagance, he seems to have had a full length of his son painted about this time by the fashionable portrait painter of the day, Jonathan Richardson the elder. This picture is now in the Fitzwilliam Museum at Cambridge. The head is good in color and modeling. A broad, pale brow, sharp nose and chin, large eyes, and a pert expression give a lively idea of the precociousness and not very healthy young gentleman of 13. He is dressed in a blue satin coat, lined with pale shot silk, and crosses his stockinged legs so as to display dapper slippers of russet leather. 1729. From Warburton's Horace Walpole and His Contemporaries. Gray, judging from his portrait by Eckhart, lately at Strawberry Hill, was eminently the poet and the scholar in his appearance. A delicate frame, a pale complexion, an expansive forehead, clear eyes, a small mouth, and regular features, bearing the general impression of thoughtfulness and melancholy, surrounded by his own hair, worn long, prepossessed the spectator in his favour, and charmed those who were already his admirers. From Gosse's Gray. Mr. Gray's singular niceness in the choice of his acquaintance makes him appear fastidious in a great degree to all who are not acquainted with his manner. He is of a fastidious and recluse distance of carriage, rather averse to all sociability, but of the graver turn, nice and elegant in his person, dress, and behaviour, even to a degree of finicality and effeminacy. 1770. End of section 40. Recording by Laura Langston. Section 41 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Henry Hallam, 1777 to 1859. From S. C. Hall's Memories of Great Men. Hallam was a tall and remarkably handsome man, very stately in look and manner. His countenance was thoughtful and intelligent, yet by no means stern. On the contrary, he was kindly and condescending. I had once occasion to apply to him for information. He gave it graciously and gracefully, and appeared as if he had received instead of conferred a compliment. From George Ticknor's Life. Mr. Hallam is, I suppose, about 60 years old, grey-headed, hesitates a little in his speech, is lame, and has a shy manner which makes him blush frequently when he expresses as decided an opinion as his temperament constantly leads him to entertain. Except his lameness, he has a fine dignified person, and talked pleasantly, with that air of kindness which is always so welcome to a stranger. He is a wise man, a little nervous in his manner, and a little fidgety, yet of a sound and quiet judgment. 1838. From Jerdon's Men I Have Known. A statue of him by Mr. Theed was sculptured for the St. Paul's Cathedral, and a good copy was exhibited at the last National Exhibition, though I was not altogether satisfied with the likeness, nor thought the accessories well chosen and happy. For a standing figure, nevertheless, it has the great merit of simplicity. Though habitually rather grave, the pleasant smile best became his features, and I do not think he was often guilty of audible laughter. End of section 41. Recording by Laura Langston.
Section 42 of Word Portraits by Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. William Hazlitt, 1778 to 1830. From Patmore's Personal Recollections. From Brian Proctor's Recollections of Men of Letters. The truth is, that for depth, force, and variety of intellectual expression, a finer head and face than Hazlitt's were never seen. I speak of them when his countenance was not dimmed and obscured by illness, or clouded and deformed by those fearful indications of internal passion which he never even attempted to conceal. The expression of Hazlitt's face, when anything was said in his presence that seriously offended him, or when any peculiarly painful recollection passed across his mind, was truly awful, more so than can be conceived as within the capacity of the human countenance, except, perhaps, by those who have witnessed Edmund Kean's last scene of Sir Giles Overreach from the front of the pit. But when he was in good health, and in a tolerable humour with himself and the world, his face was more truly and entirely answerable to the intellect that spoke through it than any other I ever saw, either in life or on canvas, and its crowning portion, the brow and forehead, was, to my thinking, quite unequalled for mingled capacity and beauty. For those who desire a more particular description, I will add that Hazlitt's features, though not cast in any received classical mould, were regular in their formation, perfectly consonant with each other, and so finely chiselled, as the phrase is, that they produced a much more prominent and striking effect than their scale of size might have led one to expect. The forehead, as I have hinted, was magnificent, the nose precisely that, combining strength with lightness and elegance, which physiognomists have assigned as evidence of a fine and highly cultivated taste, though there was a peculiar character about the nostrils, like that observable in those of a fiery and unruly horse. The mouth, from its ever-changing form and character, could scarcely be described, except as to its astonishingly varied power of expression, which was equal to, and greatly resembled, that of Edmund Kean. His eyes, I should say, were not good. They were never brilliant, and there was a furtive and at times a sinister look about them, as they glanced suspiciously from under their overhanging brows, that conveyed a very unpleasant impression to those who did not know him, and they were seldom directed frankly and fairly towards you, as if you were afraid that you might read in them what was passing in his mind concerning you. His head was nobly formed and placed, with, until the last few years of his life, a profusion of coal-black hair, richly curled, and his person was of middle height, rather slight, but well formed and put together. From Brian Proctor's Recollections of Men of Letters. My first meeting with Mr. Hazlitt took place at the house of Leigh Hunt, where I met him at supper. I expected to see a severe, defiant-looking being. I met a grave man, diffident, almost awkward in manner, whose appearance did not impress me with much respect. He had a quick, restless eye, however, which opened eagerly when any good or bright observation was made, and I found at the conclusion of the evening that when any question arose, the most sensible reply always came from him. Hazlitt was of the middle size, with eager, expressive eyes, near which his black hair, sprinkled sparely with grey, curled round in a wiry, resolute manner. His grey eyes, not remarkable in colour, expanded into great expression when occasion demanded it. Being very shy, however, they often evaded your steadfast look. They never, as has been asserted by someone, had a sinister expression, but they sometimes flamed with indignant glances when their owner was moved to anger, like the eyes of other angry men. At home, his style of dress or undress was perhaps slovenly, because there was no one to please, but he always presented a very neat and clean appearance when he went abroad. His mode of walking was loose, weak, and unsteady, although his arms displayed strength, which he used to put forth when he played at racquets with Martin Burney and others. From the Cowden Clarke's Recollections of Writers. The painting was standing on an old-fashioned couch in one corner of the room, leaning against the wall, and we remained opposite to it for some time, while Hazlitt stood by, holding the candle high up, so as to throw the light well onto the picture, descanting enthusiastically on the merits of the original. The beam from the candle falling on his own finely intellectual head, with its iron-grey hair, its square potential forehead, its massive mouth and chin, and eyes full of earnest fire, formed a glorious picture in itself, and remains a luminous vision forever upon our memories. About 1829. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Word Portraits by Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by April 6090, California, United States of America. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Felicia Hemans, 1794 to 1835. The young poetess was then only 15, in the full glow of that radiant beauty which was destined to fade so early. The mantling bloom of her cheeks was shaded by a profusion of natural ringlets of a rich golden brown, and the ever-varying expression of her brilliant eyes gave a changeful play to her countenance, which would have made it impossible for any painter to do justice to it. The recollection of what she was at that time irresistibly suggests a quotation from Wordsworth's graceful poetic picture. She was a phantom of delight when she first gleamed upon my sight, a lovely apparition sent to be a moment's ornament, a dancing shape in image gay, to haunt, to startle, and waylay. 1809. Mrs. Hemans was about the middle height, and rather slenderly made than otherwise. To a countenance of great intelligence and expression, she united manners alike unassuming and playful, and with a trust arising out of the purity of her own character, which was beyond the meanness of suspicion in others, she remained untainted by the breath of worldly guile. An engraved portrait of her by the American artist William E. West, one of 3 which he painted in 1827, shows us that Mrs. Hemans, at the age of 34, was eminently pleasing and good-looking, with an air of amiability and sprightly gentleness, and of confiding candour, which, while none of the less perfectly womanly, might almost be termed childlike in its limpid depth. The features are correct and harmonious, the eyes full, and the contour amply and elegantly rounded. In height she was neither tall nor short, a sufficient wealth of naturally clustering hair, golden in early youth, but by this time of a rich auburn, shades the capacious but not overdeveloped forehead, and the lightly penciled eyebrows. The bust and form have the fullness of a mature period of life, and it would appear that Mrs. Hemans was somewhat short-necked and high-shouldered, partly detracting from delicacy of proportion, and of general aspect of impression on the eye. We would rather judge of her by this portrait, which her sister pronounces a good likeness, than by another engraved in Mr. Corley's Memorials. This latter was executed in Dublin in 1831. By a young artist named Edward Robinson. It makes Mrs. Hemans look younger than in the earlier portrait by West, and may on that ground alone be surmised unfaithful, and though younger, it also makes her heavier and less refined. End of section 43.
Section 44 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kason from Easton, Pennsylvania on April 8, 2018. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. James Hogg, 1770 to 1835. From Lockhart's Peter's Letters. Although for some time past he has spent a considerable portion of every year in excellent, even in refined society, the external appearance of the man can have undergone but very little change since he was a herd on Yarrow. His face and hands are still as brown as if he had lived entirely sub dio. His very hair has a coarse stringiness about it, which proves beyond dispute its utter ignorance of all the arts of the friseur, and hangs in playful whips and cords about his ears, in a style of most perfect innocence imaginable. His mouth, which, when he smiles, nearly cuts the totality of his face in twain, is an object that would make the Chevalier Ruspini die with indignation, for his teeth have been allowed to grow where they listed, and as they listed, presenting more resemblance in arrangement and colour too to a body of crouching sharp-shooters than to any more regular species of array. The effect of a forehead towering with a true poetic grandeur above such features as these, and of an eye that illuminates their surface with genuine lightenings of a genius. These are things which I cannot so easily transfer to my paper. 1819. From S.C. Hall's Memories of Great Men. The Reverend Mr. Thompson, his biographer, thus pictures him. In height he was 5 feet 10 inches and a half. His broad chest and square shoulders indicated health and strength, while a well-rounded leg and small ankle and foot showed the active shepherd who could outstrip the runaway sheep. His hair in his younger days was auburn, slightly inclining to yellow, which afterwards became dark brown, mixed with grey. His eyes, which were dark blue, were bright and intelligent. His features were irregular, while his eye and ample forehead redeemed the countenance from every charge of commonplace homeliness. From Froude's Life of Carlyle. Hogg is a little red-skinned stiff sack of a body, with quite the common air of an Ettrick shepherd, except that he has a highish though sloping brow among his yellow grizzled hair, and 2 clear little beads of blue or grey eyes that sparkle, if not with thought, yet with animation. Behaves himself quite easily and well, speaks Scotch, and mostly narrative absurdity, or even obscenity therewith. His vanity seems to be immense, but also his good nature. 1832. End of section 44.
Section 45 of World Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. World Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Thomas Hood, 1798 through 1845. The Gentleman's Magazine, 1872. As he entered the room, my first impression was that of slight disappointment. I had not then seen any portrait of him, and my imagination had depicted a man of the undersize, with a humorous and mobile mouth, and with sharp, twinkling, and investigating eyes. When, therefore, a rather tall and attenuated figure presented itself before me, with grave aspect and dressed in black, and when, after scrutinizing his features, I noticed those dark, sad eyes set in that pale and pain-worn yet tranquil face, and saw the expression of the suffering mouth, telling how sickness with its stern plough had driven its silent share through that slender frame. All the long train of quaint and curious fancies, ludicrous imageries, oddly combining contrasts, humorous distortions, strange and uncouth associations, myriad word twistings, ridiculous miseries, grave trifles, and trifling gravities. All these came before me like the rushing event of a dream, and I asked myself, can this be the man that has so often made me roll with laughter at his humor, chuckle at his wit, and wonder while I threaded the maze of his inexhaustible puns? When he began to converse in bland and placid tones about Germany, where he had for some time lived, I began more reconciled to him. S. C. Hall's Memories of Green Men. In person, Hood was of middle height, slender and sickly looking, of sallow complexion and pale features, quiet in expression, and very rarely excited so as to give indication of either the pathos or the humor that must ever have been working in his soul. His was, indeed, a countenance rather of melancholy than mirth. There was something calm, even to the solemnity, in the upper portion of the face, seldom relieved in society by the eloquent play of the mouth, or the sparkle of an observant eye. In conversation he was by no means brilliant. When inclined to pun, which was not often, it seemed as if his wit was the issue of thought, and not an instinctive produce, such as I have noticed in other men who have thus become famous, who are admirable in crowds, whose animation is like that of the sounding board, which makes a great noise at a small touch, when listeners are many and applause is sure. Rossetti's Memoir of Hood, ****. The face of Hood is best known by two busts and an oil portrait, which have both been engraved from. It is the sort of face to which apparently a bust does more than justice, yet less than right. The features, being mostly by no means bad ones, look better when thus reduced to the more simple and abstract contour than they probably showed in reality, for no one supposed Hood to be a fine-looking man. On the other hand, the value of the face must have been in its shifting expression, keen, playful, or subtle, and this can be but barely suggested by the sculptor. The poet's visage was pallid, his figure slight, his voice feeble. He was always dressed in black, and is generally spoken of as presenting a generally clerical appearance. End of section 45. Recording by Nikki 504, New Orleans.
Section 46 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Sun from Easton, Pennsylvania on April 8th, 2018. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Theodore Hook, 1788 to 1841. From Leigh Hunt's autobiography. I remember one day at Sydenham, Mr. Theodore Hook coming in unexpectedly to dinner and amusing us very much with his talent at extempore verse. He was then a youth, tall, dark, and of a good person, with small eyes and features more round than weak, a face that had character and humour, but no refinement. 1809. From S.C. Hall's Memories of Great Men. When I first saw him, he was above the middle height, robust of frame, and broad of chest, well proportioned, with evidence of great physical capacity, his complexion dark, as were his eyes. There was nothing fine or elevated in his expression. Indeed, his features when in repose were heavy. It was otherwise when animated. Yet his manners were those of a gentleman, less perhaps from inherent faculty than the polish which refined society ever gives. 1828. From Barham's Life of Hooke. In person, Theodore Hooke was above the middle height. His frame was robust and well proportioned, possessing a breadth and depth of chest, which, joined to a constitution naturally of the strongest order, would have seemed, under ordinary care, to hold out promise of a long and healthy life. His countenance was fine and commanding, his features, when in repose, settling into a somewhat stern and heavy expression, but all alive and alight with genius the instant his lips were opened. His eyes were dark, large, and full, to the epithet Boalbis. He, not less justly than the venerable goddess, was entitled. His voice was rich, deep, and melodious. End of section 46.
Section 47 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Facio. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. David Hume, 1711 to 1776. From Chambers' Eminent Scotsman. Lord Charlemont, who at this period met with Mr. Hume at Turin, has given the following account of his habits and appearance, penned apparently with a greater aim at effect than at truth, yet somewhat characteristic of the philosopher. Nature, I believe, never formed any man more unlike his real character than David Hume. The powers of physiognomy were baffled by his countenance. Neither could the most skilful in the science pretend to discover the smallest trace of the faculties of his mind in the unmeaning features of his visage. His face was broad and fat, his mouth wide, and without any other expression than that of imbecility, his eyes vacant and spiritless, and the corpulence of his whole person was far better fitted to communicate the idea of a turtle-eating alderman than of a refined philosopher. His speech in English was rendered ridiculous by the broadcast Scotch accent, and his French was, if possible, still more laughable, so that wisdom most certainly never disguised herself before in so uncouth a garb. From Lockhart's Peter's Letters. The prints of David Hume are, most of them, I believe, taken from the very portrait I have seen, but of course the style and effect of the features are much more thoroughly to be understood when one has an opportunity of observing them expanded in their natural proportions. The face is far from being in any respect a classical one. The forehead is chiefly remarkable for its prominence from the ear, and not so much for its height. This gives him a lowering sort of look forwards, expressive of great inquisitiveness into matters of fact and the consequences to be deduced from them. His eyes are singularly prominent, which, according to the Gaelic system, would indicate an extraordinary development of the organ of language behind them. His nose is too low between the eyes, and not well or boldly formed in any other respect. The lips, though not handsome, have in their fleshy and massy outlines abundant marks of habitual reflection and intellectual occupation. The whole had a fine expression of intellectual dignity, candor, and serenity. The want of elevation, however, which I have already noticed, injures very much the effect even of the structure of the lower part of the head. It is to be regretted that he wore powder, for this prevents us from having the advantage of seeing what was the natural style of his hair, or indeed of ascertaining the form of any part of his head beyond the forehead. From David Hume's Life. To conclude historically with my own character, I am, or rather was, for that is the style which I must now use in speaking of myself, which emboldens me the more to speak my sentiment. I was, I say, a man of mild dispositions, of command of temper, of an open, social, and cheerful humour, capable of attachment, but little susceptibility of enmity, and of great moderation in all my passions. Even my love of literary fame, my ruling passion, never soured my temper, notwithstanding my frequent disappointments. My company was not unacceptable to the young and careless, as well as to the studious and literary, and as I took a particular pleasure in the company of modest women, I had no reason to be displeased with the reception I met with from them. End of section 47.
Section 48 of Word Portraits by Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Leigh Hunt, 1784 to 1859. From Son's Preface to Autobiography of Leigh Hunt. It was at this period of his life, as a young man, that his appearance was most characteristic, and none of the portraits of him adequately conveyed the idea of it. One of the best, a half-length chalk drawing by an artist named Wildman, perished. The miniature by Severn was only a sketch on a small scale, but it suggested the kindness and animation of his countenance. In other cases, the artists knew too little of their sitter to catch the most familiar traits of his aspect. He was rather tall, as straight as an arrow, and looked slenderer than he really was. His hair was black and shining, and slightly inclined to wave. His head was high, his forehead straight and white, his eyes black and sparkling, his general complexion dark. Few men were so attractive in society, whether in a large company or over the fireside. His manners were peculiarly animated. His conversation varied, ranging over a great field of subjects, was moved and called forth by the response of his companion, be that companion philosopher or student, sage or boy, man or woman, and he was equally ready for the most lively topics or for the gravest reflections, his expression easily adapting itself to the tone of his companion's mind. With much freedom of manners, he combined a spontaneous courtesy that never failed, and a considerateness derived from a ceaseless kindness of heart that invariably fascinated even strangers. From Brian Proctor's Recollections of Men of Letters. Hunt was a little above the middle size, thin and lithe. His countenance was very genial and pleasant. His hair was black, his eyes were very dark, but he was short-sighted, and therefore, perhaps, it was that they had nothing of that fierce glance which black eyes so frequently possess. His mouth was expressive, but protruding, as is sometimes seen in half-caste Americans. 1817. From Haydon's Autobiography. I afterwards met Hunt, and reminded him of Wilkie's intention, and Hunt, with a frankness I liked much, became quite at home, and as I was just as easily acquainted in 5 minutes as himself, we began to talk, and he to hold forth, and I thought him, with his black bushy hair, black eyes, pale face, and nose of taste, as fine a specimen of a London editor as could be imagined. Assuming yet moderate, sarcastic yet genial, with a smattering of everything and a mastery of nothing, affecting the dictator, the poet, the politician, the critic, and the sceptic, whichever would, at the moment, give him the air to inferior minds of being a very superior man. I listened with something of curiosity to his republican independence, though hating his effeminacy and cockney peculiarities. The fearless honesty of his opinions, the unscrupulous sacrifice of his own interests, the unselfish perseverance of his attacks on all abuses, whether royal or religious, noble or democratic, ancient or modern, so gratified my mind that I suffered the singular young man to gain such an ascendancy in my heart as justified the perpetual caution of Wilkie against my great tendency to become acquainted too soon with strangers, and like Canning's German, to swear eternal friendship with any spirited, talented fellow after a couple of hours of witty talk or able repartee. End of section 48.
Section 49 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Elizabeth Inchbald, 1753 to 1821. From Kavanagh's English Women of Letters. Miss Simpson was tall and slender, with hair of a golden auburn, and lovely hazel eyes, perfect features, and enchanting countenance. 1771. From Mrs. Inchbald's Memoirs. Description of me. Age, between 30 and 40, which in the register of a lady's birth means a little turned of 30. Height, above the middle size and rather tall. Figure, handsome and striking in its general air, but a little too stiff and erect. Shape, rather too fond of sharp angles. Skin, by nature fair, though a little freckled, and with a tinge of sand, which is the color of her eyelashes, but made coarse by ill treatment upon her cheeks and arms. Bosom, none, or so diminutive that it's like a needle in a bottle of hay. Hair, of a sandy auburn, and rather too straight as well as thin. Face, beautiful in effect, and beautiful in every feature. Countenance, full of spirit and sweetness, excessively interesting, and without indelicacy, voluptuous. Dress, always becoming, and very seldom worth so much as 8d. About 1788. End of section 49. Recording by Laura Langston.
Section 50 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Francis Lord Jeffrey, 1773 to 1850. From George Ticknor's Life. You are to imagine then before you a short, stout little gentleman, about 5½ feet high, with a very red face, black hair, and black eyes. You are to suppose him to possess a very gay and animated countenance, and you are to see in him all the restlessness of a will-o'-the-wisp, and all that fitful irregularity in his movements which you have heretofore appropriated to the pasteboard Merry Andrews, whose limbs are jerked about with a wire. These you are to interpret as the natural indications of the impetuous and impatient character which a farther acquaintance develops. He enters the room with a countenance so satisfied, and a step so light and almost fantastic, that all your previous impressions of the dignity and severity of the Edinburgh Review are immediately put to flight, and passing at once to the opposite extreme, you might perhaps imagine him to be frivolous, vain, and supercilious. He accosts you, too, with a freedom and familiarity which may, perhaps, put you at your ease and render conversation unceremonious, but which, as I observed in several instances, were not very tolerable to those who had always been accustomed to the delicacy and decorum of refined society. 1814. From Lockhart's Peter's Letters. I had not been long in the room, however, when I heard Mr. J. announced, and as I had not seen him for some time, resolved to stay, and if possible enjoy a little of his conversation in some corner. I have seldom seen a man more nice in his exterior than Mr. J. now seemed to be. His little person looked very neat in the way he had now adorned it. He had a very well-cut blue coat, evidently not after the design of any Edinburgh artist, light kerseymere breeches and ribbed silk stockings, a pair of elegant buckles, white kid gloves, and a tricolour watch ribbon. He held his hat under his arm in a very dégagé manner, and altogether he was certainly one of the last men in the assembly whom a stranger would have guessed to be either a great lawyer or a great reviewer. In short, he was more of a dandy than any great author I ever saw, always excepting Tom Moore and David Williams. From New Monthly Magazine, 1831. He is of low stature, but his figure is elegant and well proportioned. The face is rather elongated, the chin deficient, the mouth well formed, with a mingled expression of determination, sentiment, and arch mockery. The nose is slightly curved. The eye is the most peculiar feature of the countenance. It is large and sparkling. He has two tones in his voice, the one harsh and grating, the other rich and clear. 1831. End of section 50. Section 51 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Douglas Gerald, 1803 to 1857. From Hodder's Personal Reminiscences. To my great delight, I had not been in the room many minutes before I was introduced to Douglas Gerald, who was flitting about with that peculiar restlessness of eye, speech, and demeanour which was amongst his most marked characteristics. I confess I was not surprised to find him a man of small stature, as I had heard before that his proportions were rather those of Tydeus than Alcides. But I was a little astonished when I saw in the author of Black-eyed Susan, The Rent Day, and The Wedding Gown, all of which pieces and many others he had then produced, an amount of boyish gaiety and a rapidity of movement which one could hardly expect from a writer who had risen to high rank as a moralist and censor. From W. B. Gerald's Life of Douglas Gerald. He had none of the airs of success or reputation, none of the affectations, either personal or social, which are rife everywhere. He was manly and natural, free and off-handed to the verge of eccentricity. Independence and marked character seemed to breathe from the little, rather bowed figure, crowned with a lion-like head and falling light hair, to glow in the keen, eager, blue eyes glancing on either side as he walked along. Nothing could be less commonplace, nothing less conventional, than his appearance in a room or in the streets. From S. C. Hall's Memories of Great Men. He was a very short man, but with breadth enough, and a back excessively bent, bowed almost to deformity, very grey hair, and a face and expression of remarkable briskness and intelligence. His profile came out pretty boldly, and his eyes had the prominence that indicates, I believe, volubility of speech, nor did he fail to talk from the instant of his appearance, and in the tone of his voice, and in his glance, and in the whole man there was something racy, a flavour of the humourist. His step was that of an aged man, and he put his stick down very decidedly at every footfall, though, as he afterwards told me, he was only 52, he need not yet have been infirm. 1856. End of section 51.
Section 52 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784. From Boswell's Life of Dr. Johnson. Miss Porter told me that when he was first introduced to her mother, his appearance was very forbidding. He was then lean and lank, so that his immense structure of bones was hideously striking to the eye. and the scars of the scrofula were deeply visible. He also wore his hair, which was straight and stiff, and separated behind, and he often had seemingly convulsive starts and odd gesticulations, which tended to excite at once surprise and ridicule. Mrs. Porter was so much engaged by his conversation that she overlooked all these external disadvantages, and said to her daughter, "This is the most sensible man that I ever saw in my life." 1731. From Boswell's Life of Dr. Johnson. His chambers were on the first floor of No. 1 Inner Temple Lane. He received me very courteously, but it must be confessed that his apartment furniture and morning dress was sufficiently uncouth. His brown suit of clothes looked very rusty. He had on a little old shrivel unpowdered wig, which was too small for his head. His shirt neck and knees of his breeches were loose, his black worsted stockings ill drawn up, and he had a pair of unbuckled shoes by way of slippers. But all these slovenly peculiarities were forgotten the moment he began to talk. 1763. From Croker's Johnsoniana. The day after I wrote my last letter to you, I was introduced to Mr. Johnson by a friend. We passed through 3 very dirty rooms to a little one that looked like an old counting-house, where this great man was sat at breakfast. I was very much struck with Mr. Johnson's appearance, and could hardly help thinking him a madman for some time, as he sat waving over his breakfast like a lunatic. He is a very large man, and was dressed in a dirty brown coat and waistcoat, with breeches that were brown also, although they had been crimson, and an old black wig. His shirt collar and sleeves were unbuttoned, his stockings were down about his feet, which had on them, by way of slippers, an old pair of shoes. We had been with him some time before he began to talk, but at length he began, and, faith, to some purpose, everything he says is as correct as a second edition. 'Tis almost impossible to argue with him, he is so sententious and so knowing. 1764. End of Section 52.
Section 53 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Ben Jonson, 1574 to 1637. From Aubrey's Lives of Eminent Persons. *. He was, or rather had been, of a clear and fair skin. His habit was very plain. I have heard Mr. Lacy, the player, say that he was wont to wear a coat like a coachman's coat, with slits under the armpits. He would many times exceed in drink. Canary was his beloved liquor. Ben Jonson had one eye lower than the other, and bigger, like Clon the player. From Anderson's Poets of Great Britain. *. The character of Jonson, like that of most celebrated wits, has been drawn with great diversity of lights and shades, according as affection or envy guided the pencil. His person, as he has himself told us, was corpulent and large. His disposition seems to have been reserved and saturnine, and sometimes not a little oppressed with the gloom of a splenetic imagination. Stern and rigid as his virtue was, he was easy and social in the convivial meetings of his friends, and the laws of his Symposia, inscribed over the chimney of the Apollo, a room in the Devil Tavern near Temple Bar, where he kept his club, show that he was neither averse to the pleasures of conversation, nor ignorant of what would render it agreeable and improving. From Lafon, Notice sur Ben Jonson. Il est clair pour nous que Ben Jonson avait une nature violente dans un corps robuste et athlétique. Son portrait nous le montre avec une énorme face, une vigoureuse mâchoire, des yeux profonds et durs, un cou de taureau. Sa peau avait été, de bonne heure, couturée par le scorbut, et lui-même dit quelque part qu'il eut, dans le milieu de sa vie, une montagne pour ventre et un dandinement disgracieux pour des marches. Tous ces traits fortement accentués, anguleux ou carrés, dénoncent l'énergie, l'orgueil et l'amour des luttes de toute nature. Il aimait la bonne chair et le vin. Sa prédilection pour le vin des Canaries avait, disait-il, pour excuse la nécessité de sa constitution scorbutique. Il avait l'esprit semblable au corps. Malgré ses études classiques, il était loin d'être un Athénien. C'était un anglo-saxon hanté sur un romain de la décadence. Généreux, libéral, prodigue, il tint toujours table ouverte, même lorsque la misère était devenue l'hôte de son foyer. End of section 53.
Section 54 of Word Portraits by Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. John Keats, 1795 to 1821. From Brian Proctor's Recollections of Men of Letters. I was first introduced to him, Keats, by Leigh Hunt, and found him very pleasant, and free from all affectation in manner and opinion. Indeed, it would be difficult to discover a man with a more bright and open countenance. I can only say that I never encountered a more manly and simple young man. In person he was short, and had eyes large and wonderfully luminous, and a resolute bearing, not defiant but well sustained. From Monckton Milnes's Life of Keats. His eyes were large and blue, his hair auburn. He wore it divided down the centre, and it fell in rich masses on each side his face. His mouth was full, and less intellectual than his other features. His countenance lives in my mind as one of singular beauty and brightness. It had an expression, as if he had been looking on some glorious sight. The shape of his face had not the squareness of a man's, but more like some women's faces I have seen. It was so wide over the forehead, and so small at the chin. He seemed in perfect health, and with life offering all things that were precious to him. 1818. From the Cowden Clark's Recollections of Writers. In reviewing this portrait, Mrs. Cowden Clark, while admitting that much of it is excellent and true, goes on to add these words. But when our artist pronounces that his eyes were large and blue, and that his hair was auburn, I am naturally reminded of the chameleon fable. They were brown, ma'am. Brown, I assure you. Reader, alter in your copy of the Life of Keats, Volume 1, page 103, eyes light hazel, hair lightish brown and wavy. From Leigh Hunt's Autobiography. Keats, when he died, had just completed his 24th year. He was under the middle height, and his lower limbs were small in comparison with the upper, but neat and well turned. His shoulders were very broad for his size. He had a face in which energy and sensibility were remarkably mixed up, an eager power checked and made patient by ill health. Every feature was at once strongly cut and delicately alive. If there was any faulty expression, it was in the mouth, which was not without something of a character of pugnacity. His face was rather long than otherwise. The upper lip projected a little over the under. The chin was bold, the cheeks sunken. The eyes are mellow and glowing, large, dark, and sensitive. At the recital of a noble action or a beautiful thought, they would suffuse with tears, and his mouth trembled. In this there was ill health as well as imagination, for he did not like these betrayals of emotion, and he had great personal as well as moral courage. He once chastised a butcher who had been insolent by a regular stand-up fight. His hair, of a brown colour, was fine and hung in natural ringlets. The head was a puzzle for the phrenologists, being remarkably small in the skull, a singularity which he had in common with Byron and Shelley, whose hats I could not get on. Keats was sensible of the disproportion above noticed between his upper and lower extremities, and he would look at his hand, which was faded and swollen in the veins, and say it was the hand of a man of 50. 1826. End of section 54.
Section 55 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. John Keble, 1792 to 1866. From J. Coleridge's Memoir of the Reverend John Keble. To me, both the portraits are full of deep interest. These portraits of Keble, the one in the prime of manhood and the other in old age, were drawn by Richmond. The earlier and the later both. Each brings him back to me as he was. In the earlier, he has some of the merry defiance he could assume in argument. In the latter, I see the sad tenderness of his advanced years. Keble had not regular features. He could not be called a handsome man, but he was one to be noticed anywhere and remembered long. His forehead and hair beautiful in all ages. His eyes, full of play, intelligence, and emotion, followed you while you spoke, and they lighted up, especially with pleasure, or indignation, as it might be, when he answered you. The most pleasing photograph is one in which he is standing by Mrs. Keble's side. She is sitting with a book in her hand. The later photographs are to me very unpleasant. I will attempt no more particular description, for I feel how little definite I can convey in writing. From the Christian Observer, 1871. Mr. Keble greeted us, emerging from his little study, the door of which, as I afterwards noticed, oftener than not stood open. His features, indeed, were familiar to us, as to most people, from the engraving of Richmond's first portrait of him, taken in middle life for Sir John Coleridge. Now the original stood before me, and I saw at a glance that face and figure had been faithfully portrayed. The forehead was pale and serene, the hair silvery. Doubtless this token of advancing years must have helped to give softness and refinement to the features. Eyebrows sprinkled with white, shaded eyes of singular brilliancy and depth of expression, as ready, I afterwards well knew, to light up with mirth and mischief while playful talk was going on, as they were to melt into mournful earnestness when graver topics were broached. He habitually wore glasses, but used often to take them off and hold them in his hand when conversing with animation. A dear and old friend of his has told me that he looked almost boyish till about 50, and after that rapidly aged in personal appearance. At this time he was in his 61st year, healthy and strong and active. In appearance he was quite one's ideal of an old-fashioned country clergyman, but of one whose Oxford days were still fresh in his mind. There was a touch of vieille cour in his manner, which added, I think, to its charm. His voice in speaking was rather low, and especially so when the subject of conversation was very near his heart. It often struck me, when listening to him, that without the slightest effort or aim at effect, he always hit upon the most suitable and telling words, and the shortest, in which to clothe his ideas. This unconscious beauty of language, coupled with the originality and wisdom of the ideas themselves, riveted them in one's memory. The look, too, with which they were uttered, could not be forgotten, and rises as vividly before my mind's eye through the golden mist of years, as though it belonged to the present instead of the long ago. 1852. From L. A. Huntingford, private letter. People who went to look at Mr. Keble as a lion were, I think, disappointed to see a very simple, old-fashioned clerical gentleman, with very little manner, and so completely unconscious of self that as he talked of common things, they were inclined to think as little of him as he thought of himself. He used to come down early and stand writing at a side table till it was quite time for prayers and breakfast, and then sit down anywhere, and with a little peculiar jerk of the head and shoulders, read a short instruction, almost as if he were reading it to himself. Certain people even called his reading bad, for his voice was weak, and he had a slight cough which never wholly left him, but he brought out the meaning of Holy Scripture in a manner which I never heard surpassed. Mr. Keble was of middle height, very thin, with a splendid forehead, bright eyes which were rather hidden by his spectacles, and a sweet, merry smile. Those who knew him well must remember the way in which he used to pull himself together, as if he were a boy obeying a well-known rule to hold up his head. His manner was nervous, so much so that people who were not intimately acquainted with him were rarely quite at their ease when in his presence. The two pictures of Mr. Keble by Richmond are both good likenesses, but the lithograph of the head, which was taken from the then unfinished picture which, in its completed form, now hangs in Keble College, Oxford, has caught the peculiar intelligence of the eyes when lighted up with the eager brightness his friends knew so well. He had the unusual power of being able to write upon one subject and listen to the discussion of another at the same time, and he would often glance up from the paper in which he was apparently immersed, and, pushing up his spectacles, join eagerly in the conversation. End of section 55. Recording by Laura Langston.
Section 56 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. Word Portraits of Famous Writers. Edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Charles Kingsley, 1812 to 1875. From Caroline Fox's Journals and Letters. Torquay, January 30th. Charles Kingsley called, but we missed him. February 3rd. We paid him and his wife a very happy call, he fraternizing at once, and stuttering pleasant and discriminating things concerning F. D. Maurice, Coleridge, and others. He looks sunburnt, with dredging all the morning, has a piercing eye under an overhanging brow, and his voice is most melodious and his pronunciation exquisite. He is strangely attractive. 1854. From the Galaxy, 1872. I was present at a meeting not long since, where Mr. Kingsley was one of the principal speakers. The meeting was held in London. The audience was a peculiarly Cockney audience, and Charles Kingsley is personally little known to the public of the metropolis. Therefore, when he began to speak there was quite a little thrill of wonder and something like incredulity through the listening benches. Could that, people near me asked, really be Charles Kingsley, the novelist, the poet, the scholar, the aristocrat, the gentleman, the pulpit orator, the soldier-priest, the apostle of muscular Christianity? Yes, that was indeed he. Rather tall, very angular, surprisingly awkward, with thin staggering legs, a hatchet face, adorned with scraggly gray whiskers, a faculty for falling into the most ungainly attitudes and making the most hideous contortions of visage and frame, with a rough provincial accent and an uncouth way of speaking, which would be set down for absurd caricature on the boards of a comic theatre. Such was the appearance which the author of Glaucus and Hypatia presented to his startled audience. Since Brougham's time, nothing so ungainly, odd, and ludicrous has been displayed upon an English platform. Needless to say, Charles Kingsley has not the eloquence of Brougham, but he has a robust and energetic plain speaking which soon struck home to the heart of the meeting. He conquered his audience. Those who at first could hardly keep from laughing, those who, not knowing the speaker, wondered whether he was not mad or in liquor, those who heartily disliked his general principles and his public attitude, were alike won over, long before he had finished, by his bluff and blunt earnestness and his transparent sincerity. From Fraser's Magazine, 1877. For 9 years the portrait of Kingsley, close to that of John Parker, has looked down from the wall of the room in which I write. It is a large photograph, taken while he was on a visit to the house by an amateur of extraordinary ability, the late Dr. Adamson of St. Andrews. It is the best and most lifelike portrait of Kingsley known to me. It has the stern expression which came partly of the effort, never quite ceasing, to express himself through that characteristic stammer which quite left him in public speaking, and which in private added to the effect of his wonderful talk. Photography caught him easily. Those who look at the portrait prefixed to Volume I of The Life see the man as he lived. Mr. Woolner's bust, shown at the beginning of Volume II, shows him aged and shrunken, not more than he was, but more than he ought to have been. And the removal of all hair from the face is a marked difference from the fact in life, yet the likeness is perfect too. That somewhat severe face belied one of the kindest hearts that ever beat, yet the handsome and chivalrous features unworthily expressed one of the truest, bravest, and noblest of souls. Kingsley could not have done a mean or false thing. By his make, it was as impossible as that water should run uphill. End of section 56.
Section 57 of Word Portraits by Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Charles Lamb, 1775 to 1834. From De Quincey's Life and Writings. Lamb, at this period of his life, then passed regularly, after taking wine, under a brief eclipse of sleep. It descended upon him as soft as a shadow. In a gross person laden with superfluous flesh, and sleeping heavily, this would have been disagreeable. But in Lamb, thin even to meagreness, spare and wiry as an Arab of the desert, or as Thomas Aquinas, wasted by scholastic vigils, the affection of sleep seemed rather a network of aerial gossamer than of earthly cobweb, more like a golden haze falling upon him gently from the heavens than a cloud exhaling upwards from the flesh. Motionless in his chair as a bust, breathing so gently as scarcely to seem entirely alive, he presented the image of repose midway between life and death, like the repose of sculpture, and to one who knew his history, a repose contrasting with the calamities and internal storms of his life. I have heard more persons than I can now distinctly recall observe of Lamb when sleeping that his countenance in that state assumed an expression almost seraphic from its intellectual beauty of outline, its childlike simplicity, and its benignity. It could not be called a transfiguration that sleep worked in his face, for the features wore essentially the same expression when waking, but sleep spiritualized that expression, exalted it, and also harmonized it. Much of the change lay in that last process. The eyes it was that disturbed the unity of effect in Lamb's waking face. They gave a restlessness to the character of his intellect, shifting like northern lights through every mode of combination with fantastic playfulness, and sometimes by fiery gleams obliterating for the moment that pure light of benignity which was the predominant reading on his features. 1822. From Froude's Life of Carlyle. He was the leanest of mankind, tiny black breeches buttoned to the kneecap and no further, surmounting spindle legs, also in black, face and head finish, black, bony, lean, and of a Jew type rather. In the eyes a kind of smoky brightness, or confused sharpness, spoke with a stutter, in walking tottered and shuffled, emblem of imbecility, bodily and spiritual, something of real insanity, I have understood, and yet something too of human, ingenuous, pathetic, sportfully much enduring. Poor Lamb! He was infinitely astonished at my wife, and her quiet encounter of his too ghastly London wit by a cheerful native ditto. Adieu, poor lamb. From Talfourd's Reminiscence of Charles Lamb. Methinks I see him before me now, as he appeared then, and as he continued, with scarcely any perceptible alteration to me, during the 20 years of intimacy which followed, and were closed by his death. A light frame, so fragile that it seemed as if a breath would overthrow it, clad in clerk-like black, was surmounted by a head of form and expression the most noble and sweet. His black hair curled crisply about an expanded forehead. His eyes, softly brown, twinkled with varying expression, though the prevalent feeling was sad, and the nose slightly curved and delicately carved at the nostril, with the lower outline of the face regularly oval, completed a head which was finely placed on the shoulders, and gave importance and even dignity to a diminutive and shadowy stem. Who shall describe his countenance, catch its quivering sweetness, and fix it for ever in words? There are none, alas, to answer the vain desire of friendship. Deep thought striving with humour, the lines of suffering wreathed into cordial mirth, and a smile of painful sweetness, present an image to the mind it can as little describe as lose. His personal appearance and manner are not unfitly characterized by what he himself says in one of his letters to Manning of Braham, a compound of the Jew, the gentleman, and the angel, written shortly after Lamb's death. End of section 57.
Section 58 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Langston. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Letitia Elizabeth Landon, 1802 to 1838. From Crabb Robinson's Diary. Miss Landon, a young poetess, a starling, the L.E.L. of the Gazette, with a gay, good-humoured face, which gave me a favourable impression. 1826. From Blanchard's Life of L.E.L. Her hair was darkly brown, very soft and beautiful, and always tastefully arranged. Her figure, as before remarked, slight, but well-formed and graceful. Her feet small, but her hands especially so, and faultlessly white and finely shaped. Her fingers were fairy fingers. Her ears also were observably little. Her face, though not regular in every feature, became beautiful by expression. Every flash of thought, every change and colour of feeling lightened over it as she spoke, when she spoke earnestly. The forehead was not high, but broad and full. The eyes had no overpowering brilliancy, but their clear intellectual light penetrated by its exquisite softness. Her mouth was not less marked by character, and besides the glorious faculty of uttering the pearls and diamonds of fancy and wit, knew how to express scorn or anger or pride as well as it knew how to smile winningly, or to pour forth those short, quick, ringing laughs which, not excepting even her bon mots and aphorisms, were the most delightful things that issued from it. 1832. From S. C. Hall's Retrospect of a Long Life. Small of person, but well formed. Her dark silken hair braided back over a small, but what phrenologists would call a well-developed head. Her forehead full and open, but the hair grew low upon it. The eyebrows perfect in arch and form. The eyes round, soft or flashing as might be, grey, well formed and beautifully set. The lashes long and black, the underlashes turning down with delicate curve, and forming a soft relief upon the tint of her cheek, which, when she enjoyed good health, was bright and blushing. Her complexion was delicately fair, her skin soft and transparent, her nose small, retroussé, slightly curved, but capable of scornful expression, which she did not appear to have the power of repressing, even though she gave her thoughts no words, when any despicable action was alluded to. About 1835. End of section 58. Recording by Laura Langston.
Section 59 of Word Portraits of Famous Writers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Word Portraits of Famous Writers, edited by Mabel E. Wotton. Walter Savage Landor, 1775 to 1864. From Crabb Robinson's Diary. He was a man of florid complexion, with large, full eyes, and altogether a leonine man, and with a fierceness of tone well suited to his name, his decisions being confident, and on all subjects, whether of taste or life, unqualified, each standing for itself, not caring whether it was in harmony with what had gone before, or would follow from the same oracular lips. But why should I trouble myself to describe him? He is painted by a master hand in Dickens' novel, Bleak House, now in course of publication, where he figures as Mr. Boythorn. The combination of superficial ferocity and inherent tenderness, so admirably portrayed in Bleak House, still at first strikes every stranger. For 22 years have not materially changed him, no less than his perfect frankness and reckless indifference to what he says. 1830. From S. C. Hall's Retrospect of a Long Life. He was at that time 60 years of age, although he did not look so old. His form and features were essentially masculine. He was not tall, but stalwart, of a robust constitution, and was proud even to arrogance of his physical and intellectual strength. He was a man to whom passers-by would have looked back and asked, "Who is that?" His forehead was high, but retreated, showing remarkable absence of the organs of benevolence and veneration. It was a large head, fullest at the back, where the animal propensities predominate. It was a powerful but not a good head, the expression the opposite of genial. In short, physiognomists and phrenologists would have selected it, each to illustrate his theory. 1836. From Harriet Martineau's Biographical Sketches. His tall, broad, muscular, active frame was characteristic, and so was his head, with the strange elevation of the eyebrows, which expresses self-will as strongly in some cases as astonishment in others. Those eyebrows, mounting up until they comprehend a good portion of the forehead, have been observed in many more paradoxical persons than one. Then there was the retreating but broad forehead, showing the deficiency of reasoning and speculative power, with a preponderance of imagination and a huge passion for destruction. The massive self-love and self-will carried up his head to something more than a dignified bearing, even to one of arrogance. His vivid and quick eye, and the thoughtful mouth, were fine, and his whole air was that of a man distinguished in his own eyes, certainly, but also in those of others. Tradition reports he was handsome in his youth. In age he was more. End of Section 59.